Welcome to History Twists, the podcast where we delve into the crossroads of history and explore what might have been. Today, we're looking back to 1968, a year fraught with tension during the Cold War, a year when a small spark in the waters of East Asia nearly ignited a global conflict. This is the story of what could have happened had the Pueblo Incident escalated into a full-scale war. January 23rd, 1968, North Korea seizes the USS Pueblo, an American intelligence vessel, claiming it had violated their territorial waters. Now, the whole conflict about that, North Korea said that they claimed, I believe it's 23 miles off of their shore to be their waters, whereas international law indicated a great deal less than that. But nonetheless, it was a spy vehicle or spy vessel. The U.S. government denies these accusations, calling the capture an act of aggression. As the world holds its breath, President Lyndon B. Johnson faces a critical decision: how to respond to this brazen move by the North Korean regime. In our timeline, the U.S. pursued a diplomatic approach, leading to a tense but ultimately peaceful resolution after 11 months of negotiations and having those men in captivity during that time. However, what if things had gone differently? What if Johnson, already under immense pressure from the Vietnam War, had opted for a more forceful response?
Imagine an emergency meeting in the White House. The Joint Chiefs of Staff argue that a show of strength is necessary to prevent further communist expansion in Asia. They present the president with a plan, Operation Hammer Strike, a series of targeted airstrikes on North Korean military installations designed to cripple their ability to respond. The blockade begins similar to what happened during the Cuban Missile Crisis, leading to, in the North Korean response, a public execution of one sailor. Fearing that any sign of further weakness could embolden North Korea and its allies, President Johnson reluctantly approves the operation. On February 2nd, 1968, American bombers took off from bases in Japan and South Korea, heading towards their targets. The world braces for what comes next. The strikes are devastating. Key North Korean military facilities are destroyed, but the North Korean regime, led by great leader Kim Il-sung, is undeterred. In retaliation, North Korea launches a massive artillery bombardment on the South Korean capital, Seoul, and their ground forces cross the 38th parallel, the demilitarized zone, marking the beginning of the Second Korean War. Meanwhile, fearing American encroachment on its borders, Communist China mobilizes its forces. To prevent vital equipment from falling into communist hands, the Pueblo was destroyed and blown up. The Comte de Marchais, the head of French intelligence, referred to this brilliant idea, the destruction of the ship, as the Incheon of this Second Korean War. By March of 68, China threatened to send its troops into the war. The U.S. is now fighting a two-front war in Asia, with American casualties mounting rapidly. As the conflict escalates, other Western powers take notice. The United Kingdom, under Prime Minister Harold Wilson, and Australia, already fighting in Vietnam under Prime Minister John Gordon, offer military assistance to the United States. Both nations, wary of the spread of communism and committed to supporting their American ally, begin preparing their troops for deployment to Korea. Although initially reluctant, Canadian Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau also commits to sending a contingent of peacekeepers, hoping to stabilize the situation. New Zealand Prime Minister Keith Holyoake sends one regiment of soldiers, and France dispatches 25,000 of its best troops, led by French Commander-in-Chief Michael Fourquet. De Gaulle had a solid commitment to Korean independence.
Many changes came about from this war. China, remember at this time, it remains on the verge of collapse. The army, which took orders from Foreign Minister Zhou Enlai, the Communist Party, led by Marshal Lin Biao, and the fanatical Red Guard, who regard Chairman Mao as a god, continue to control the destiny of 800 million people. This lack of one authority prevents Mao's decision to invite Nixon to visit China. The lack of the Nixon visit prevented China's embracing of the free market and economic development of the 1980s. In this timeline, China's difficulties led to greater opportunities for the Taiwanese and Indonesian economies. The industrial base of the United States would survive. Politically, the main difference is that Taiwan retains its strong alliance with the West. Both liberals and conservative wish to lower the national frustration levels. Violent protests in the U.S. lead to assaults on public buildings. That leads to a dual approach: incentives to encourage volunteers and harsher punishments for protesters who turn violent. Soldiers who serve in Korea are guaranteed exemption for any other draft age relatives, a $10,000 bounty, and a year's tax exemption, freedom from taxes. This tax moratorium was the pet project of Senator Roman Huska of Nebraska. Conservatives passed the Protect America Act, which provides a 5-year prison sentence for defacing symbols of the nation. Wish that had happened in our timeline. January 6th might have been quite different, eh? Conservatives also ramped up aid to Alexander Dubček and his resistance to the Soviet Union in Czechoslovakia. Prime Minister Dubček sought aid from around the world. Yugoslav President Tito sought to assist the Czech resistance. In Western Europe, German Defense Minister Franz Strauss called to serve in Chancellor Willy Brandt's non-political government of national unity, has ambitions to restore Germany's place on the political stage by aiding the cause of freedom for the Czechs. Some people fear a Fourth Reich. It is rising in Germany. This resistance by a Warsaw Pact nation terrifies the Soviet leadership, and we're talking about Czechoslovakia here. It also engendered a big debate within the Politburo concerning whether aiding the Asian communists in Vietnam and Korea was more important than pacifying a rebellious satellite in Eastern Europe. After the instability of the Khrushchev era, General Secretary Brezhnev and Prime Minister Kosygin wished to ensure stability. The more ambitious faction, led by chief ideologist Mikhail Suslov and Belarusian head Kirill Mazurov, wanted to shame China by an intense effort to aid Korean comrades. Mazurov, a former tank commander, offered to take command of combat troops directly. Let us visit that Politburo meeting. Moscow is filled with ice. It's wintertime. As chilly as the air in the room where the elite class of the classless society, of course, gathers around the table in the Kremlin. Let's eavesdrop on that meeting.
Are we going to abandon everything we have built in Eastern Europe over 25 years to cater to a madman in Asia. Prague is falling, comrades. We must deliver fraternal assistance in our own backyard first. I don't trust Kim anyway. He thinks like a bourgeois, romantic shopkeeper, not a man of the people. What do you think, Comrade Susov?
Is we forget about our ideas every time there is trouble. We are not worthy of the high offices we hold. Remember what Lenin said in 1917, the power was lying in the streets waiting for someone to pick it up. We have neither been closer than we are now to ultimate success. We owe it to history to maintain our ideals. The decision was made to focus on controlling Prague. The North Koreans railed against receiving more food and propaganda rather than troops and weaponry. Oh, well. The Czechoslovakians resisted street by street, successfully defending their chosen government. Poland withdrew its forces after 3 months. This semi-defeat would embolden anti-Russian forces throughout the world. I believe that an opportunity for transformation of the world could have taken place.
There are three possible difficulties with this war and the larger political changes it could have made possible. The movement for African independence was accelerated by the Cold War. An assertion of American dominance on a larger scale 20 years before it actually happens might lead to discontent in the developing areas. On a positive note, the peace dividend, which took place in the 90s in our time, medical research, to give only one example, would benefit from a large infusion of cash. Both Asian wars are very different in the attitudes they engender in the public. The Korean people are seen as being more willing to fight for their own freedom. They are more unified than the Vietnamese, both culturally and politically. The Vietnamese body politic is seen as too confused. Korea is also militarily easier to defend as it's smaller. The greater amount of international support for aiding the Koreans diffuses some criticism. Our allies make wonderful attempts and play a vast part in this war. British and Australian forces quickly integrate with American units, bringing with them vital experience from other Cold War conflicts. British RAF squadrons join in the aerial campaign, while Australian infantry bolster defensive lines within South Korea. The additional Western forces provide a much-needed boost to the beleaguered American and South Korean troops. They also draw the attention of the Soviet Union. The Politburo, as we said, does not want to lose points in the international communist purity contest with China, but they don't want to engage in unnecessary combat either. French forces win a major psychological victory when they seize the city of Haiyan, located in the Pektu Mountains at the border with mainland China. Mount Pektu was sacred in North Korean mythology because it was the location of the mythical secret base from which Kim Il-sung had directed his guerrillas against the Japanese in World War II. In reality, he had done that from Manchuria. French forces decide to weaken the government by developing a plan to kidnap Kim Il-sung and his even more fanatical propaganda-oriented son, Kim Jong-il. Since the weakness of both Kims was for the fairer sex, Japanese intelligence decided to recruit a courtesan who could keep the two entertained, while the Canadian Intelligence Bureau proceeded first to kill Kim Sr.'s personal guard and then to take the two North Korean despots away. When negotiations for the exile failed, the dictators suffered an accident to the regret of no one.
Right, an accident. Okay, fearing a broader Western intervention, the Soviet Union dithers over supplying advanced weaponry and military advisors to North Korea. The conflict threatens to draw in more nations as NATO debates whether to offer further support and the Warsaw Pact nations prepare for possible involvement. The war in Korea becomes a flashpoint for global tension, with Europe on high alert. As Western and Eastern powers mobilize, the threat of nuclear war looms larger than ever. The situation deteriorates, with both sides preparing for potential escalation. Meanwhile, the 1968 presidential election becomes a referendum on both the Asian wars. There were three different candidates and three different points of view. One faction wanted the North Koreans and the North Vietnamese conquered and those countries united. Sounds a little like a carryover from the U.S. Civil War, doesn't it? Another faction just wants the U.S. to get out of the mess altogether. Sounds like the same isolationism rampant before World War One. Interesting, isn't it? And still another faction wants to preserve U.S. prestige and power in Asia without any more bloodshed. Sounds like a pipe dream. The U.S. public was caught like a deer in the headlights of an oncoming truck. Not only were we fighting other nations, but the infighting amongst ourselves ramped up to new heights. Most of the public felt there was no way to win. Some felt more war pressure would result in nuclear annihilation. Some felt that a soft response or withdrawal would damage U.S. integrity towards allies and thereby destroy both our prestige and ultimately our economic stability. The third group felt that any move we made would have bad consequences, so we just needed to preserve ourselves and act like a drowning man, just keeping floating in hopes that Superman would come and rescue us all.
In this alternate timeline, Vice President Hubert Humphrey, the Democratic candidate, secures the endorsement of American Independent Party candidate George Wallace, with both of them modifying some policy goals. They agree that racial segregation must end and plot out a step-by-step methodology to raise the education and possibilities open to non-Caucasians. They get endorsement from Howard University and prominent Black conservatives. In designing those steps, in return, Humphrey openly endorses a more affirmative military action in both Vietnam and Korea, based on the international support that was growing. In a very close election, Humphrey wins.
Newly independent Czechoslovakia tries to avoid a harsh Russian reaction by remaining neutral, similar to what Switzerland would do. Divisions and weariness becomes overwhelming to the North Koreans, and several factions blame Kim for this sad state of affairs. A plot is hatched, and Kim is assassinated, as Dr. Deneen already plotted out for us. In the vacuum created by this assassination, more moderate people take control of the North Korean government, paving the way for a possible reconciliation with the South. By 1970, after 2 years of intense fighting, a fragile ceasefire is brokered. The Korean peninsula is pretty devastated, and the geopolitical landscape has shifted dramatically. North and South Korea are rejoined, and elections for president of United Korea is held and monitored by the UN, with Switzerland taking the lead. North and South Korea each elect governors, and a central committee is formed as an advisory board to the president of Korea. The U.S. and its allies began the process of rebuilding and cleaning up the mess that was left there, joined by some of their allies. The U.S. manages to form diplomatic relations with China and Taiwan, despite each of them originally refusing to have diplomatic relations if the other has diplomatic relations. Sounds like two kids on a playground. Because of the reluctance of the USSR to provide substantive military aid in the conflict, and the U.S. making it clear that recognition and communication with Taiwan and China was an absolute necessity, non negotiable, talks were held, and benefits for both countries were delineated and accepted ultimately.
So in this alternate timeline, massive amounts of money were spent, many lives were lost, and the world sadly edged closer to a nuclear war. In the end, Korea was reunited and would benefit from significant reconstruction and international aid. Many in the Politburo of the USSR felt they had suffered defeat in Czechoslovakia and Korea, but also felt they had gained some advantage over China, solidifying the USSR as upholding the truth of Marxism. This confusion and lack of confidence in their current leadership instigated a turnover in leadership. The border with Czechoslovakia felt more secure after a new treaty between them and the USSR, allowing some relaxation of tensions between the Soviet Union and the rest of Europe. Thus, we return to the present timeline, where the Pueblo incident ended not in war, but in a negotiated settlement. History, as we know it, is often defined by the decisions made at critical junctures. The path which is not taken can be as instructive as the one that was. Thank you all for joining us on this journey through an alternative history. Until next time, stay curious, keep on exploring the echoes of what might have been.
Yeah, it's kind of fun, isn't it? And we enjoyed this, and we hope that you will join us for further explorations. We got some goodies coming up and some controversial ones too. Could be a lot of fun. Don't miss it because, you might disagree, and that's great. Disagree and let us know. We love it. We love dialogue.
We sure do, folks. I mean, we want to get people thinking. If you're interested in what really happened as regards to Pueblo, check out our Things You Don't Know podcast about that. But there are many more things coming in both podcasts.
Yes.
And we're looking forward to it.
Absolutely. All right. Well, we could go on to this topic like so many others. We could just go on and on and on, and that would not be in the best interest of everybody. So for now, bye bye.
So long, folks.